Behold, my glorious supporter EyePatchNotes has requested Parley about Warframe Augment mods. That's augment mods for Warframes, not just augment mods in Warframe. EyePatchNotes asks, what do you feel is the role of Warframe augment mods? Which mods wholly or partially reflect this role? How has the helmet system affected this role? You said maybe that's too nebulous. I don't think so. Since we're still waiting on the MOA mods, I thought I'd bring up another design space that sends mixed messages. So EyePatchNotes here is referring to a previous question they asked about the role of set mods. There's another set mod question I'm going to record later today as well. People seem really interested in this lately. Maybe you inspired that. I thought I'd bring up another design space that sends mixed messages like aura and set mods. There are a few schools of thought on their design. Personal opinion time. So EyePatchNotes has attached two spoiler-covered little personal opinions. So I'll talk to you a little bit first, and then I haven't clicked those yet. I'll click them and respond. What do you feel is the role of Warframe augment mods? Well, in short, they should be to augment the ability, of course, and that means they should they that was such a corny way to start discussing augment mods that my mic physically tackled me to stop me from discussing them that way. They need to make the ability meaningfully better, but not feel required. They need to make the ability do something more than its core self, but then the ability itself needs to do something worthwhile on its own. I think that the biggest difficulty with Warframe augmented mods is that they require a good ability, like a balanced ability. If you make an augment mod for an ability that has problems, the augment mod will be problematic, even if it wouldn't be if the ability was in a good place. Because it can often lead to cases where it seems like the augment just fixes the ability, but actually the ability could easily do something worthwhile on its own, and then the augment would just be another option. A baseline for discussing augments, beyond what I just said, is to think about whether they are vaguely analogous to a normal Warframe power stat mod. The biggest reason that some players misunderstand augment mods and think this ridiculous claim that keeps coming up where people want like a slot just for augment mods, that makes no sense. The entire point of Warframe's buildcraft is that you have to make trade-offs. You don't have infinite mod space, and you trade a thing off. Having more mod slots actually makes the feeling of mandatory mods worse, as I've talked about a lot with weapons, and it's less true, but still true, with Warframes. Modding gets less interesting the more mod slots you have. Necromechs have 12 mod slots, which makes them immediately really boring to build for, rather than being some interesting design idea, because it means that you can just equip everything, and it's not an interesting choice. Those things then feel like a chore rather than choices. That's bad, and it's good if it's limited. So to make that feel good, instead of making it feel like you have to sacrifice things for something you need, again, you need to make the augments powerful on their own, but also on powerful abilities, and they can't feel too core. I think there's something about augment mods being like different enough from the base ability that it doesn't feel like the ability is just lesser without it. The ability should kind of do something a bit more. But anyway, let me give you a few examples. So Firewalker has an augment that I really like. Firewalker is Nezha's ability where you run around and leave fire trails. It doesn't really make you much faster, but it is very good for zone control. You can run down hallways, you can run circles around objectives, and enemies are now not really capable of passing through those spaces. A very good, robust ability by itself. It does something and it does that thing well, and that thing is pretty much zone control. And then the augment, Pyroclastic Flow, makes it so the trail doing damage to enemies accumulates. That stores, kind of like Equinox's Maim. And then you can kick out that damage and consume it in a sort of line-based fire trail that you fires out from the front of you, not the back of you, that then does damage for a short duration based on the damage absorbed. That is a damage nuke ability. This augment is really good because it doesn't do the same thing as Firewalker, but it feels related to Firewalker. It's powerful, it does lots of damage, and it's even good with Firewalker. It doesn't feel unrelated. Enemies that are stuck in Firewalker in a line are perfectly susceptible to the damage from Pyroclastic Flow. So the Augment is good, but in a very different way than the base ability, yet it's good with the base ability. It feels related. A very, very good example of an Augment. Even if you don't like it, I hope you can see how that's a really good example of an Augment that basically checks all the boxes. It hits the design goal. I feel like that is, in many ways, an ideal Augment. A few other examples of things I think are fine. So Titania has her Spellbind, which makes enemies float. You can cast it on allies to make them status immune, and it purges their statuses for a little while. That also makes them immune to self-stagger from explosive weapons. So yeah, it's like a crowd control ability. The enemies float, which I don't love, but they float. And then it can make you immune to status and self-stagger. The Augment, Spellbound Harvest, makes it so if you hit 4 or more enemies, you get energy back. The energy you get back is based on strength, and then, of course, the cost of the ability goes down with efficiency. I like this one. I like it because it gives you a different reason to use the ability, so it's not exactly the same as Firewalker in Pyroclastic Flow, where the Augment does something meaningfully different, but is, kind of related. This is one where the Augment makes the ability useful for something else. So that's dangerous because it means that it might feel mandatory. Then it's like you can't get that ability unless you use this Augment. So the way to fix that, I think, is to make the effect powerful, and it is, because it gives you energy. There are not very many abilities in the game that restore energy, and this is one of the better ones. With low duration, you can get an absolutely absurd, basically infinite energy if you have enough enemies around, which is really powerful. Even if you don't have low duration, you can't recast this, but you still get a lot of energy. If you have high range, sometimes this affects too many enemies, and then you end up making yourself unable to do it again because you affected too many enemies at once with the first cast. So that's a little finicky, but it's not really bad overall. It's a little unintuitive. I kind of wish it was like if you hit 8 enemies, you get the energy twice. Like that would be fair, sure. So it's a minor nitpick, but overall, I do think that's a good second kind of augment. So it makes the ability, it says you could now use this ability for something different, for a purpose you didn't have for it before, but that purpose is very powerful. So it feels fair. I think it feels fair. I think that the only issue is that, again, Spellbind is not like a great ability by itself, but it doesn't really feel mandatory because the augment doesn't make it do the thing it already does better. In fact, the ability really can't be made to do the thing it does better. The thing it does is simply not that powerful. It's not terrible, but it's not great. The augment instead makes the ability to do something else of an appropriate power level to warrant a mod slot. I think that's fine. And again, a good example of how you don't immediately need to have an augment be bad just because the ability it's on is a little questionable. It's possible to solve that issue as well. Okay, some examples of bad augments. There are some kind of 2 categories of these where I feel like they either the thing they do isn't a thing you want to do in Warframe. That's kind of a ongoing theme in the game. A lot of the time things are added to the game that like you just don't want in Warframe. Like Warframe is not a game where that is a powerful thing. It feels like something if you understood Warframe well, you would not add this to the game because it's not good in this game. So we'll talk about that. And then there's another example where the augment is simply too weak, or the ability is too weak, like the ability holds the augment back directly. Obviously, there are many examples of abilities that are just not very good, and then they have an augment, and it feels like it makes the ability like it's only worth using with the augment. We're not going to get into those too much. I'm going to try to talk about the ones where it's not just like, obviously you should buff the ability. Actually, let's give a quick example of that just in case. So again, not those 2 categories I just said. As an example of an augment that is for an ability that's just bad, and then it's like the augment lets you use the ability more, but like it's not a good ability. Basically, every augment for Valkyrie is like this, except Eternal War, sort of. Valkyrie doesn't really do anything. Her kit is like all passives or very, very specific utility abilities that are not powerful. So like Ripline has an augment where you can swing with it more. I think it's called Swing Line, in fact. If you use it to grapple the environment, I believe, you get to use it like 4 more times in succession for free. I think it does something. It's terrible, so forgive me for not knowing exactly what it does, but it's something like that. And Ripline is just not powerful. This is a game where you're given such high levels of mobility. It's just not that powerful to have a Spider-Man ability. That's not valuable. If you've played Risk of Rain 2, Loader with her grapple, that's a really good example of a game that has some mobility, but where it's valuable to have more. And that game, it was brilliant of them to add a mechanic like that. It's a really good fit for that game. Warframe is a game where the idea of Spider-Man is like cool, I guess, in the abstract, but is it cool in Warframe? No, because it's slower than the mobility effect you already have on every Warframe, bullet jumping. So yeah, that ability just doesn't belong in the game, I would argue. Or it's outdated. Remember, Valkyr's from a long time ago, so the parkour didn't always used to be like that. But in the current state of the game, an ability like that just doesn't make any sense unless it has some other bits and bobs. Also, by the way, you can pull allies with Valkyr's Ripline and like throw them off the map. Anyway, just saying, rework Valkyr. Anyway, Valkyr, in fact, has another augment. You could argue maybe 2 augments that I feel this way about as well. So Paralysis has prolonged paralysis. So paralysis is you lose some shields, you stun, probably open to finishers, like some enemies in a cone in front of you, and then they take damage equal to the shields you lost. Valkyr has like no shields, so it's not meaningful damage. It's like a stun, but it's a very, very limited. It's like the weakest crowd control ability in the entire game. And then it doesn't cost very much energy, though. Prolonged Paralysis is an augment for it that sucks enemies in, so it makes it into a grouping ability. Valkyr is sort of interested in that. Like, you have the claws. Like, she has a powerful exalted melee weapon, but yeah, melee weapons are already powerful. And this is a really good example of an ability that just does nothing. And then there's an augment that makes it do something, but not really something related per se to what the base ability does, and not something so powerful as to make you feel like, I'm going to play Valkyr because of this augment. Now, there's a separate discussion to be had that I'm not going to have here. If somebody wants to ask about it, I think it's a long discussion that I'd be happy to have about whether having an ability augment get added to the game is a, quote, good way to add buildcraft to Warframe. Is it good if we add an augment for an ability and then that adds build diversity? I think it is, but some people don't, and it's complicated. I get that. Augments are not innate to the ability, and it's really hard because it's like they're important, they're powerful, they influence a lot of Warframe buildcraft. There are very few builds that I've made that you don't want any of the augments. Like, it's almost always the case that I think an ideal build for doing a thing with a Warframe a certain way includes like some augments. They're powerful. Like, there's no, that's the whole point. They are good, so they feel like you want to include them. They often earn a spot, if you want me to say it that way. And because of that, it's rare to make a build that would at least not be better if it had augments on it, which makes it feel like augments are just part of the ability, because they sort of are, but you don't. It's not like you automatically have them. Anyway, now I'm just doing the entire discussion. You can see how that would be a lot. Yeah. Right. So those are examples of augments that are just terrible because the ability's bad. The augment does something that's not valuable in Warframe. They're just a mess. But there are other examples. I'm going to give the most notorious one, or what I think is the most notorious one, of a bad augment. It's Rhino's Roar augment. I don't know what this is called, and I don't care because it's garbage. Roar is a good damage buffing ability. The augment makes it recastable. No, bad. The ability should just be recastable. That is fixing an ability using an augment. This is something that, if you view an ability as not being good and you want to fix it to your own tastes using an augment, that's fine. But the developers of the video game don't need to do that because they, develop the video game and they can just make the ability recastable, which it obviously should be. So that's an extremely stupid way to make augments. I hate that augment. Developers, if you're listening, you should be ashamed of that augment. It's an extremely naive design decision. You can just make the ability recastable. that is a baffling design choice. I don't understand. It does not make sense. Make the ability recastable. Roar's Augment also puts a puncture proc on enemies. Yeah, that's really weak. Reducing enemies' damage dealt is already bad in Warframe, and you made an ability that is good because it makes you kill enemies faster and dead enemies don't do any damage. You made that ability reduce the damage enemies deal. Why? I'm sorry, I hate this augment because it's stupid and does not make any sense. And it was made to check a box to make more augments for an update. They should have just not made it, and they should make Roar recastable. This is not an augment that was made with any thought given to the game it was being put in. They just thought, what are things you could do, I guess, like on an augment, and then put them on. It makes no sense. It is an atrocious augment, and it's only a few augments like this. There aren't that many augments like this. It's these few augments like this that make players misunderstand how good augments are. It's the ones that have different mechanical applications that people just don't get into because the game kind of makes it seem like they're not worth it because there are simple augments like this that are just stupid. So anyway, get rid of those. Those are terrible. And then there's another category of augment that I think is like a little weird. So these are augments that they augment an ability's ability to do something that it's already good enough at, or another ability is already better at. This is where we're going to transition to the helmet system with Trinity's Well of Life. Trinity has a Well of Life augment called Pool of Life that generates health orbs and a chance for an energy orb. Or do you always get an energy orb? When you kill the enemy. It's probably just health orbs. You get like 4 health orbs, and I think you get a chance for an energy orb. That's the health orbs that are important. We'll get back to that in a minute. So on the surface, this augment makes the ability heal more, but Well of Life already heals enough. Like you're never going to care about more healing if you have this ability. So adding more is not good. The potential, so there's a whole category of augments like that. I should think of another example. But anyway, to finish up the thing about the energy orbs, the potential here is if you use Equilibrium, the ability can make a lot of energy. Now, Trinity doesn't really care about that because she has Energy Vampire, but Well of Life is shareable with the helmet system. So that means that if you give a Warframe Well of Life, and then you add the Pool of Life augment and Equilibrium, the ability makes a lot of energy. If you use it on an enemy and kill the enemy, you get like 100 energy. You can use Synth Fiber on your Sentinel to make sure you can always pick up energy orbs, health orbs, even if you have full health. Having Synth Fiber on your Sentinel will allow you to pick up health orbs at all times, even if your health is full, because they would benefit your Sentinel's armor, so the game lets you pick them up. By the way, you should just be able to pick them up. Anyway, whatever. However, Protea shares Dispensary, and Dispensary with Equilibrium also gives you 100 energy from the empowered health orb that it gives. So Well of Life, Pool of Life is essentially just worthless. Unfortunately, I did not know that when I made my Helminth tier list, so I put an addendum in the comments of that video. But yeah, that ability is not basically ever worth infusing unless you have some very specific interaction with Well of Life. But that's the whole point. Pool of Life doesn't make Well of Life do anything that you care about being able to do, given that you can cast Well of Life. Like, the base ability invalidates the augment. You don't need more of that effect. This is a case where it's simple to fix from an ideological perspective, but not from a programming perspective. You have to make it do something completely different, but ideologically it's fairly simple. You just need to make it do anything else. Like, the ability does enough of that thing. You don't need to make it better at it. Just make it have a different effect. Just have it do something else. Overall, I think it is safer to make augments feel less mandatory and more interesting to just make augments as a rule do something that is not really the same as the ability. Try to think about what situation the ability creates or invites, and then make an augment that makes the ability do something different than what it currently does, but something that is good in that situation. Again, Firewalker, Pyroclastic Flow is a great example. It doesn't need to be better at zone control. It's already an amazing, one of the, maybe the best zone control ability in the game. It doesn't need to be better at that. So what situation does it create? Oh, well, enemies are in a line. What if it did damage to enemies when they're in a line? Brilliant. Perfect. And then it doesn't feel mandatory. If you're taking the ability for its zone control, you don't really care about doing damage. Like, maybe you don't care about doing damage. To give you a few quick examples, I think Volt is fairly interested in Firewalker. I'm going to make a video with that in it very shortly. And Ember is pretty interested in Firewalker for her passive, because you light enemies on fire and you get strength. But Volt, I think, is interested in the Augment, while Ember really isn't, because you could just use Ember's 4th ability to do big damage to enemies. You know, they're in a line, but whatever. You don't really need a damage nuke. Doesn't really add much, or at least I don't think it does. And so that's another good sign of a good Augment. Are there situations where you clearly want the Augment or could want the Augment, and then other situations where you clearly don't want the Augment, or it's redundant anyway? The answer is yes, and I think that's good. Whereas for something like Well of Life, the Augment is redundant or inferior in every situation. On Trinity, it's redundant and inferior. The healing's inferior to just using Well of Life with like more mods to support it. And the energy restoration with Equilibrium is redundant with Energy Vampire. When shared with the Helmet system, it's inferior to using Dispensary in the exact same way. I guess the only thing there is, like, I guess Trinity's easier to get than Protea. Not that much, just saying. Like, she is easier to get than Protea, but like not easy. I wouldn't say easy, you know. Anyway, so those are examples. I wanted to quickly think of an example of an ability that is also like the Augment makes it do more of what it already does, and you just don't need that. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sure you can think of some. I want to quickly put a pin in an idea I would like to come back to. I'm going to talk about the helmet system thing. This video is getting really long, but that's fine. It's a big topic. And then we're going to talk about EyePatchNotes spoiler warning things, personal opinion stuff, and I'll respond to that if I have not already yet. And then I want to eventually, at the end of the video, I want to go back to talking about a design space for augments that I think is a little underutilized, but is also like a little tricky. I mentioned that I thought making abilities better at what they already do is a little dangerous. Making it just like a straight upgrade to the ability, that's a little dangerous. They should do something different. But there's a type of augment that kind of avoids that problem that I think it'd be nice if we got more of, and that's Atlas's Landslide Augment. So I think it's his Landslide Augment. It might be his passive augment. It's the one that makes Landslide free if you have a lot of rubble. I think that one is pretty interesting, and I'd like to come back to that. So put a pin in it. And then the last thing I wanted to say is they should allow us to put multiple augments on the same ability at once where possible. I think most of the time you can, and there's no problem. A really good example is Ivara's Quiver. You can get the augment that lets you fire 3 arrows, and you can get the augment that makes the stealth arrows make you immune to status, and the dash wires give you critical damage when you're on them. Both of them are good, but you can't equip them both at the same time, and you would want to equip both of them at the same time in some situations. There's no, it's not like there would be a programming problem. Just allow us to equip both at once. Maybe there's some back-end programming issue. What I mean is, like, it's not like it would break the game in some way. Like, there's no balance issue. There's no... They don't do a thing that is conflicting. It's not like you'd have to program in a way for Atlas to have his rumbled armor and then also have rumblers out. Like, maybe there's a problem there, sure, because maybe they're coded as like just different abilities and they swap. But this is a case where it's like it just makes the ability do 3, or like the effect of being on the dash wire, you know, or being in the stealth arrow is different. So clearly there's no like impossible conflict there. Just let us use both. There are some where maybe you shouldn't let us use both, but that should be a case-by-case thing. There are a lot of augments that for Warframes that now have 2 augments for an ability since they made those PvP ones available in PvE, that it'd be really fun if you could equip both, and there's really no reason you shouldn't be able to, so you should be able to. Cool. So now let's just... the helmet thing, I already addressed it a little bit. The helmet system has affected this role because it allows you to add more things to a Warframe when infusing an ability. That's how I would view it. For example, if you infuse Firewalker on a Warframe, you get a zone control tool. But because Firewalker has an augment that is good and does something different, you can kind of add 2 abilities to a Warframe because Pyroclastic Flow does something appreciably different. There are many cases where the ability isn't really doing what you're looking for unless you have the augment, and then the helmet system kind of asks a mod slot of you. Creates this interesting balancing thing where abilities can be good in different ways by accomplishing something but without using an augment slot. So for example, if you want energy for your Warframe, the only ability in the game that restores you energy reliably without an augment, so in other words, you have no space on your build, you can just infuse an ability with the helmet system. The only ability that gives you energy without investing an augment reliably is Protea's Dispensary. So that has a niche that it might not otherwise have. We'll get back to that. Because it doesn't require an augment to give you the energy. And then other abilities do want an augment from you, but they give you more energy. Now, the only problem, of course, is that if you put Equilibrium, which is a mod, not an augment, but it's still a mod slot, on Dispensary, it then gives you more energy than all of those other abilities, which is a little bit of an issue. But they're good in different situations. If you don't have a lot of duration, Dispensary is not great. And if you have low duration, Titania's Spellbound Augment is very powerful, and it's also cheaper energy to activate by a lot. It's 25 instead of 75, which is Dispensary. And so that means that you can potentially get a lot more mileage out of it if you have certain stats on your build. I don't think the Dispensary is the only good energy restoring ability, but it does, you can see how like whether an ability does it with an augment or not can sort of add a niche to a thing. I do think that also sometimes reinforces the idea that the ability is like only worth using if you have the augment. I think the illusion that's happening here is that you are only infusing the ability for the effect it gives with the augment, but the ability does something worthwhile that you use when you play the Warframe the ability is native to without the augment. That's not why you're infusing it. You know, your purpose for it is this, but that's because you're deliberately adding it. I think this is the kind of thing where if the game was better at this overall, if less abilities were just bad, if all augments, not just most augments, really fit the mold that the good augments set the example for, I think that people would feel less concerned and distracted by like, this ability is only good because it has this augment. I think it's the kind of thing where there's a critical mass of success or failure, and then you suddenly start to think of it everywhere. I don't think it's actually a huge issue. Overall, I think the helmet system has been interesting for augments. It highlights them a little more. I think augments are a little unusual. Like people think it's like out of the ordinary to have like a lot of augments on a build because they're like, you can't use normal Warframe mods on them. Like, no, they're the same as other Warframe mods. Like it's normal to have lots of augments. It's just an endgame upgrade. So I don't know. That's mostly what I think about the helmet system. Mostly I think it is good for the build diversity of the game. I was a little worried it would feel like there wouldn't be enough good options to infuse, but while there are a lot of really bad options, there are lots of good options, and I feel like there are meaningful choices to be made where, as I make framework and I'm making like 100 different builds for various Warframes, and it is going to be like around 100 different builds, I don't think it's going to feel like we're infusing the same ability like every single time, you know. We will certainly come back to abilities like Dispensary, Titania's Spellbind Augment, maybe Firewalker. These are abilities I think I'm going to use multiple times, obviously, because there's 100 and there aren't 100 different infuse abilities, but I don't think it's going to feel like we're repeating them all the time. It's going to be a tool that we come back to when it's necessary or when it's valuable. So I think that's fine. I really like the helmet system for augment mods. Okay, wow, 28 minutes about yammering about augment mods. Let's click EyePatchNotes spoilers and read. Okay, I'm most excited, EyePatchNotes says, for augments that dramatically alter casting paradigms or stat scaling. As a core mod slot is somewhat steep as an opportunity cost, there is ample room for augment mods to sharpen a Warframe's identity. For example, Halide Eruption changes Halide Grand's damage over time into burst, but doesn't muddy its identity as a damage ability. Even better, it gives the player a starting point, as if it was saying, thank you for trying out this new playstyle. Here's some duration. Feel free to build more or include other stats instead. Ooh, okay, cool. Yeah, so Halide, let's talk about that. That's a good example. So this is similar to what I was talking about with the Atlas Augment. So actually, let's talk about that now. So Halide Eruption is an augment for Oberon's hallowed ground. That's the grass. that causes it to not you cast the grass, and then I believe this is how it works, you recast it, and instead of getting more grass, the grass will like explode, and it will do all the damage it would have done over its full duration all at once. And that means if you build duration and or strength, you get more damage. It basically scales. It's like status duration, sort of. You're scaling how much damage the burst does, and then you could just do it again. So you could go hallowed ground, you do big burst damage, hallowed ground, you do more burst damage, etc. And if you had a lot of energy, you could use that for damage in a fairly large area. The range is pretty large. Halide Eruption also gives you some duration, and I agree, I like these kinds of mods. It doesn't give you duration for everything, I think it's just for hallowed ground, but it's similar to Mag's Magnetize Augment. It makes the range bigger, and then it allows you to blow up. In fact, those augments are almost exactly the same. Gives you more range for Magnetize, and then it lets you blow it up by recasting if you want. So I love how you say, it's like, thank you for trying out this new playstyle, doing damage, with bursting this ability that comes from Halide Eruption. Here's some duration as well. So you could build more. We're inviting you to. Duration does increase the damage after all. Maybe you'll notice that since we just quietly included some duration. And then the player will be enraptured by the idea of getting big damage from Halide Eruption by building strength and duration. Obviously, strength increases the damage, but they might not have realized duration will now increase the damage too, and then maybe they think of that. And so they give you some, and then if you don't want to build into that, it's still good because it gave you some duration. So now this could still be useful. I'm not sure it is still useful as a nuking ability if you don't build all into it, but it could still be useful without like a ton of that thing. Same thing with Magnetize. If for whatever reason you don't want to build a lot of range, again, for these specific Warframes, I'm not sure I agree that there's like that there's actually enough incentive to build something else, but in concept, it's a very, very good idea. I agree. That's a great example. How this is a little similar to Atlas's Landslide Augment is, I don't remember exactly how this augment works, but the idea is that once you have a lot of rubble, Landslide is free and has some other effects. It doesn't cost energy is the point. So if you can maintain high rubble, which is hard, then Landslide is free. What I like about that is that these things should be trade-offs. If they're going to be something powerful, that's fine. If they're not just more, that means that players may often not like them. For example, Halide Eruption doesn't let you cast Hallowed Ground all over the place. You can only have one, which is a meaningful drawback, and in exchange it gives you theoretically a powerful scaling effect. Same thing with Atlas's Landslide. It might seem like it's just an upgrade to Atlas's Landslide, but actually it's asking you to maintain your rubble instead of your energy. It's actually a trade-off, but it sounds powerful. You get this effect for free. I think it is powerful, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying it's not literally just better. It asks something of you. It says, do you want to do this playstyle? Like you said, thank you for trying out this new playstyle. Like, here is the payoff. Like, or you could do, the Atlas one doesn't invite you to do something else, but you get the idea. Cool. Yeah, a fantastic thing to add. Going on with what EyePatchNotes said, so that was the first little spoiler. EyePatchNotes says, in general, I favor augments with riding effects, a core stat offered in a narrow scope. Magnetized Discharge offers a stretch-like boost for the same slot cost, reducing some of the friction when it comes to player creativity. It's not to say I agree with the idea of an augment slot or equally kicking all augments upstairs to the Exolus slot. Warframe is in my mind an exercise in opportunity cost and resource management. Core mod slots are themselves resources. This is part of a larger philosophy of stat efficiency versus slot efficiency, but that is a topic for another time. That's true, it is. But yeah, I as I was mentioning before, I totally agree. That's a really good segue into the last thing I haven't talked about yet, which are Exolus Augments. Now, the Exolus slot for weapons is pretty strict. You pretty much only get utility. Anything that could give you more damage, even if only sustained damage, is not in the Warframe in the weapon Exolus slot. So, for example, reload speed and magazine size don't belong in the weapon Exolus slot, and you can't put them in there, rightly so, because they add damage to your weapon. Warframe is a horde shooter. There are always things to shoot. So something that lets you be shooting more often gives you damage just the same that base damage gives you damage. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's damage, all the stuff, well, not all the stuff, but almost all the stuff that's in the Warframe, the weapon Exolus slot, damn it, okay, is stuff that could increase your damage. Accuracy increases, flight speed increases, but if you play a certain way, the damage increase goes away. So for flight speed or like shotgun fall-off range increases, you can get closer, and then the Exolus Augment doesn't do anything. That makes it a utility or usability augment rather than just straight up damage. Generally, it's pretty good with the weapon Exolus slot. The philosophy goes that if this could increase your damage in a way you could not replicate except with this mod or some other effect, then it doesn't go in the weapon Exolus slot. It has to be something that just might conveniently increase your damage, but you could play differently to get the same damage increase. Obviously, that's it, depending on how much you extrapolate that, that's true of other things, but you get the idea, right? For the Warframe Exolus slot, EyePatchNotes and I have talked previously about how the Warframe Exolus slot is not really, it's kind of cheating. The drift mods in particular give you like strength in the Warframe Exolus slot, but it's like not that much, so it's fine. It's not fine because it means that the other utility effects like bullet jump speed or sprint speed, those effects are now competing with something that is not on the same playing field, something that would normally be competing for a normal mod slot, but suddenly these weaker utility effects that were given their own slot so that it doesn't feel bad to equip something else instead, so that you're free to just equip this effect instead of feeling bad about like, I lost strength because I want sprint speed. Sprint speed is fun to me, but I don't feel good about equipping it because I need to sacrifice strength. Now you don't get that anymore. That's the only thing that the Warframe Exolus slot would accomplish, and it doesn't accomplish it because you can get power stats up there. So that's bad. However, there are a lot of Warframe Augment mods that are Exolus mods that I think do a good job because they follow the philosophy. There are things that you sort of could do with that ability, but it's a utility thing. You could kind of replicate it through gameplay, or it's just like you might just want this. It's not, more powerful directly. It's just an option. A really good example is Mesa's Waltz. This is I think it's called Mesa's Waltz. The thing that lets you move while using Peacemaker, but you can only move slowly. Reactivating Peacemaker over and over again means you don't get that smaller aiming reticle. You could build range, but you can have low range and have a big reticle if you reactivate over and over again, but you might simply prefer to keep the ability active for longer. You could build a whole playstyle around just being in Peacemaker if you wanted to. It's not really more powerful. It's just kind of it could be, but it's just an option. And so it's appropriate for that to be in the Warframe Exolus slot. It's a movement thing. It's a utility thing. Enemy radar. You could just go find the enemies, but this gives you some convenience. You don't feel bad about sacrificing power for it because it's in the Warframe Exolus slot. Stuff like that. There are a few offenders. Octavia's Conductor augment comes to mind. You might not be familiar with this, but you should be because it's awesome. Octavia's Resonator, that's her second ability. You put down a roller ball, and it sort of Pied Pipers the enemies. If they get near it, they get kind of hypnotized to it, and they follow it around like a little parade of baby ducklings waiting to be killed. Conductor lets you control the roller ball directly. You can use reactivating the ability in your aiming reticle to tell the ball to go where you want instead of it just wandering around with the AI. And the key thing is that if you tell it to go somewhere, it stays there. It doesn't move around anymore. This makes the ability no longer rely on basically the AI to control your crowd control ability. Instead, you have a very long duration hypnosis ability to control space that you can move around as much as you want. It moves pretty fast too. That's a Warframe Exolus mod. Now, it is a movement ability, so that's, the problem is that the ability is pretty bad without it. It can make enemies be grouped up but run away from you, which is not good. Things being controlled by the AI is not good. Your Resonator picking up your mallet and running away with it instead of going where you want is really bad. So I would argue that Resonator is kind of I mean, it's not like useless, but it's kind of a counterproductive ability. Like, as often as not, you're just flipping a coin on whether it will make you worse off if you cast it, unless you cast Conductor. And I sort of feel like, because that feels mandatory, you know what I mean? This is a little bit of a tricky one because it's not like the ability's effect is bad. It's like the way the ability does the effect. What it feels to me like is that there needs to be some way. This is a really hard one because it's like, how do you make that ability not have that effect innately? But maybe it just should have that effect innately, you know? It's the kind of thing where it feels like the ability just doesn't hold up without the augment. Now it's a Exolus augment, so it feels like you have your own augment slot. This is part of the reason people keep saying they want their own augment slot, because some augments have their own augment slot. You can put them in the Warframe Exolus slot, and that feels good to people because they don't have to make a trade-off, even though the whole point is to make a trade anyway. So yeah, I think it actually feels good to people because it feels like they've come up with something clever. They have a really good trade-off. They're not trading off something valuable. It's not that they don't get to make a trade-off. It's that the trade-off feels good. And then if the trade-off just felt good in a normal mod slot, then it would feel good. But anyway, I won't yammer on about that anymore because this is 40 minutes long now. Holy shit. Anyway, yeah, so I think that's a tricky one. There are some offenders in the Warframe Exolus slot. I kind of like the spirit behind things like Valkyr's Frenzy. I don't remember what it's called. Her Claws ability. That has an augment that lets you like jump to enemies. That effect is bad in Warframe because you can already jump to enemies with a bullet jump. Valkyr has 2 augments that are redundant with bullet jumping. It's almost like this frame was designed a long time ago, but that second augment for jumping with your claws, that was designed after bullet jumping was introduced, so there's no excuse. However, I do think that's really cool. I like the idea of, you said like changing casting paradigms. I like the idea that the augment kind of like adds a new attack, except it isn't actually, but imagine if it did. That sounds kind of cool. That's something I could get behind. As it stands, it doesn't really do that, but yeah, it would be interesting to see more stuff like that. And that stuff could belong in the Warframe Exolus slot because it just gives you a different way to deliver the damage kind of thing. So I don't know. Overall, I really like Warframe augments. I think they're really a system that is done in a lot of different ways, and I think a lot of those ways are really good, and a lot of those ways are really bad. In fact, a couple of months ago, I scripted an entire video reviewing every single Warframe augment, and I rated it based on various factors. The idea was to show how, objectively, most augments actually are good enough on their own. They do warrant a mod slot. A lot of them, many of them, about 50% I was finding, do something that is basically exactly the same as a normal Warframe mod. So a lot of them, like, they represent duration, or some of them literally give you duration, but a lot of them, it's like Lullaby has an augment, Endless Lullaby, where if you kill an enemy during Lullaby, then it spreads the sleep. That's basically duration. Like, it's not exactly the same as duration, but it is analogous to duration. So to say that that's not worth a normal mod slot is just wrong, because it is literally a normal mod slot. It does basically the same thing in fact, if anything, it's more powerful than a normal mod slot. And there are quite a few augments like that. But as I went through, I was really startled by the number of design philosophies behind augments. There's a few that are like cycles. In fact, I've just decided, as we're talking literally right now, that I should really review them that way. I should go back and put them into cycles. Like, there's a whole little cycle of augments where they remove armor. So they make the ability additionally able to remove armor. Ash's Seeking Shuriken, Banshee's Sonic Fracture. Those augments are basically exactly the same. They're augments for a Warframe's first ability that does something unrelated to removing enemy defenses, that allows them to remove enemy defenses 70% at base, affected by strength. They are basically exactly the same, and they're both pretty good for what it's worth. They're nice and neat. They ask a little bit of you, the player. They're good even if you don't build into them. They're just better if you do. They're nice. On cheap abilities, you can use a lot. I think Seeking Shuriken is a little better because it's a one-handed action, but what are you going to do? Yeah. So anyway, I will make that video at some point. I'm just not sure when. But I did script a video that was talking about like every augment. and sort of demonstrating how they have a lot of different design philosophies, and a lot of them are really good and very similar to normal mods. And the reason it feels like a lot of them aren't that good to a lot of people is because a lot of them aren't good. Not most of them, though. Like, a lot of them are. It's a matter of perspective. And if you focus on the ones that are good because you make builds for a career, then you probably think that they're good, right? If you don't make builds for a career and you're instead just trying to get your favorite Warframe, Rhino is popular. I wonder if Rhino's augments are good examples of an augment. No, one of them is that terrible Roar augment. Also, Iron Skin has that notorious Iron Shrapnel augment that, like, it doesn't really make the ability recastable. I think that one's like borderline maybe okay, where you blow up your Iron Skin and then then you can recast it, but I think you should probably just be able to recast it. Anyway, there's like 2 augments for this popular Warframe. The Warframe that, if people say I'm a new player, the number one most popular advice that not creators, but that players give to other players is go get Rhino. Iron Skin will help you through the early game. And what are 2 of Rhino's augments like? Oh, they're augments that just like fix the basic ability. I wonder why people think augments are not that good. That's why, and if you actually look at them all, it gives you a different perspective. It does not like prove that you're wrong for thinking augments are not in a good place. Like, it just highlights that there are a lot of bad ones and a lot of good ones. And that's not the reason for an augment slot. I will end this video by confessing something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I am afraid that Warframe is going to get an augment slot. I feel like our developers have recently been doing such a bad job of moderating community opinion. They listen to the community say something and then they just do it. They don't think about whether it belongs in the game, they just do it. This doesn't always happen, but I feel like 66% of the time it happens. There are examples of it not happening. A lot of players, I'd argue most players, don't understand why reload speed and magazine size should not be in the weapon Exolus slot, but they obviously shouldn't be if you think about it from a philosophical perspective, and our developers did not include them there. Almost certainly for basically the exact same philosophical reason that I talked about. As a matter of fact, I made a video that talked about every single utility mod, the thing I thought was utility related, and I categorized them based on like the stage I thought they were competing on. If I can find this video, I'll link it below. And what we got was during a dev stream, they showed the weapon Exolus slot and they showed what was preliminarily going to be in there. And it included like reload speed and stuff, which is not a good idea for reasons detailed in that video, which are probably obvious to all of you. But then when the system came out, even though community sentiment had been, you should totally include that stuff, which is completely wrong, they didn't include that stuff. I noticed that they retooled it in a way that was nearly identical to the purely philosophical focused way that I was discussing it. Not to say that I'm right and they agreed with me, just to say they clearly did not listen to player feedback. They clearly just did a thing that made sense with a certain line of game developer reasoning. It might not be the only way that made sense. In fact, in my video, I highlighted that there could be another way it could make sense. I just think that this way is better. And the fact that they did a way that is based on a philosophy rather than community sentiment is an interesting sign. But it doesn't really make me feel that much better, because knowing our developers are capable of this, I mean, I've met most of these people. I know they're capable of this because they're smart people. I don't understand why they keep doing this thing where they just listen to the community instead. And I'm worried that if nobody says bad things about a Warframe augment slot after a long time, like, I think that they know it's not a good idea, but eventually they're just going to put it in anyway. They know that self-damage is a good system and stagger is not a good way to implement it, but players really wanted to get rid of self-damage and they wanted to make the player base happy, so they just threw in this mechanic that was, I would argue, a terrible idea. That could happen again, and it'd be really, really bad. If they add a Warframe augment slot, a lot of Buildcraft is just borderline destroyed, because there will be a mandatory feeling augment for like 90% of Warframe builds. Like, almost every build It will be like you never think about this slot. You just have to throw away another hour of your life and 2 forma to fill this slot, and you're never going to think about what's in it. It will always be this augment for this type of build, and that's it, and you never think about it again. It will be a pure loss. It will change nothing about the game. It will just spend time, and I guess you could argue consume money, but it also consumes money having limited mod slots, so if that's why they wanted to do it, that'd be a misguided approach. If you have limited mod slots, you have to reforma a lot, you have to forma a lot, etc. So anyway, so I hope that doesn't happen, and I probably will make a video about that, because to end on a positive note, I do really love talking about augments, as you can tell, because I spent 50 minutes talking about them. Yowza. Okay, thank you very much for your glorious question, EyePatchNotes. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your support.